So welcome everyone to our M3 Challenge webinar on Ask Me Anything. I'm so excited to have all of you here with us. Also joining us is Dr. Jen Gorman. She's a professor at Lake Superior State University, and Jen's been involved with the challenge for many years. So Jen, what would you like everyone to know about you?
Yeah, so I teach math at Lake Superior State University. We're up here in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. So like throws distance from Canada up in the UP of Michigan. The M3 challenge, right, is one of my favorite things to do. I've been involved with it for a pretty long time, right? I started out as a triage judge for many years, and then I got to do the next round of judging, the contention round judging, and I'm now actually part of the problem development committee. So I'm part of the team that writes the problem every year. So it's super fun, and it's some of my favorite work to do all year round.
So for those of you who have attended the other webinars, the last one that we had was the practice problem, most recently on single point of failure. And for everybody who, I'll point out where it is on the website in just a minute, but if you didn't get a chance to make that webinar, you will prominently you'll see featured in that problem, the locks that are right near you. And that's not a surprise because that was sort of the genesis of the question, actually, right? Was that shipping lock. So
yeah, it actually came from going on the tour boat, where in the tour boat, if you come to Sault Ste. Marie, you go through, the tour people give this one little line that is yeah, if the locks were to fail, it would have catastrophic effects on the economy. And I was like, oh, that sounds like a problem. So
it does sound like a problem. It was a good one. Yeah. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share screen right now, and I'm going to point us all to the M3 Challenge website. Okay. All right, Jen, you can confirm to me that you're looking at that page with me?
it is not. Yep, there it is. Perfect.
Okay. Thanks.
I was like, it just takes a second.
So hopefully everybody has seen the M3 Challenge webpage, m3challenge.siam.org. But I just wanted to point out a handful of things. Actually, before we even start, I am going to point out a handful of things. But before we start, I am curious for everyone who's here on this webinar, if you would be willing to drop into the chat something that you would like to learn about M3 Challenge during this webinar. So I'm going to give everybody a minute before we get started and let me know what you're interested in learning while we're here today. Because that's the point, is that you guys get to ask anything. Formatting preferences. Good. Anything else? What problems can be about and what prerequisites are needed? Okay, so maybe we can ask Jen, hey, what's this year's question about?
I can't tell you.
For everybody who's here on the call, if you are registered for the challenge, then you'll be signed up to get our email alerts, those things that come into your inbox called M3 Minute. If you're not yet registered, you can go ahead and register today. I'll show you how to do that. But there's also up in the top left of the website, there's something called Get Alerts. That's a way to get those emails as well. And next week, we'll be sending out a haiku clue. So you can get a little hint about what the challenge question might be. But as you may already know, we don't release the topic until challenge begins. So Jen's not going to divulge that information right now. Okay. All right. I'm seeing a lot of good questions. So please keep those coming. And in the meantime, I'm just going to point out a handful of things here on the webpage. And if there are more questions that come to you as we're talking, then we'll answer those as they come up. So first thing I wanted to note on the webpage is the register button. So if you are not already registered for the challenge, you can click here and get your team registered. So you'll need a team of 3 to 5 students and a coach. The coach is typically a teacher, but doesn't have to be a teacher. Any adult will do as a coach, but you can go ahead and register your team. If your school isn't listed in the drop down, there's a way for you to reach out to us, and we'll add the school to the system, and then you can get a team going. Okay, and then so the brief overview is that the challenge is completely free to register and participate, and it will happen over a challenge weekend, which happens to be this year, February 28th to March 3rd. So that's a 4-day window. That's a Friday through a Monday. And you and your team would agree to meet on a particular one of those days. And whichever day it is that you've decided, then you will get together, download the question. And when you download the question, that starts your 14-hour clock. So you've got 14 hours in which to upload a solution. So that's when you'll find out what the big open-ended question is about, and see what the data looks like, and then you get 14 hours to come up with a solution. So those are sort of the big overview. A lot of this information you can find if you click right up here on the challenge on the web page. This gives you that kind of overview. Okay, so registration deadline, this is when challenge weekend is this year, and then there's a little bit of information about the website. I might also encourage you to watch this video at some point. It's really fun. It's a cute little video that'll make you feel excited about competing. There's some more information down here, and yeah, so there's all sorts of good information there. If I also point out other things that are under the challenge, there's an important dates, an important dates page. This is information about the scholarships. So how many are there, and what are the different levels? There's some information about judging. One that I want to point out in particular is this rules and guidelines. So when you register, you'll be required to say that you've read the rules and guidelines, and they're kind of a lot. So there's, as you can imagine, with a contest this big, there's a whole bunch of fine print. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of information here that I would encourage you to read through it, and it's a lot to read, but it's actually probably better to read it in advance than to be working through the middle of the challenge and then just say, and then you're having a conversation and say, are we allowed to do that? Should we be doing that? It's probably better to read through the rules and guidelines. Somebody was asking about the preparation of the solution paper a little while ago, about what format is preferred. So there's a whole section on what is required. I would say probably there's not so much that's, explicitly required. The biggest one is that the file size has to be less than 10 megabytes. Beyond that, you want to make sure you don't put your team information on it. So I know in school you're probably like used to putting your names right on the front. We don't want your names, just your team ID on the paper. That way it's a blind judging process. So the people who are judging these things don't get to know who you are or what school you go to. They're going to judge them purely based on the content in the paper. There have been solution templates in the past, but this year we have a separate page for solution templates. If you are using MATLAB, which is not required, but it's a nice tool. So if you want to use MATLAB, there's a MATLAB live script template that you can use. If you want to use the Word document, that's a really good one because it actually includes a bunch of tips right in the document for what should go in this section, what should go in this section. So that's a nice document. We do offer another software system called LaTeX. We have a template in LaTeX. If you've never used LaTeX before, now is probably not the time to use it for the first time. I love LaTeX, and there's a reason why we have it up here because we know that teams are using it. It's a great software, but there's a steep learning curve. So if you don't know LaTeX, maybe you want to use the Word template. Totally up to you. The nice thing about all three of these templates is they all meet the guidelines that we have set up in those rules and guidelines. So if you want to get a head start on that solution paper and make sure you have the right format, starting with one of these templates is a good idea.
Equals.
Okay, so let's see.
Can I just turn it in or give it to you now then? Sure. So I'll get a 20 out of 20, Miss S. Wait, what?
Oh. Alrighty, let's see. I'm gonna move on to resources. If you all end up here on the resources page, you're gonna see a whole bunch of resources that fly by. We've got handbooks, we've got a whole page with tips and guidance. There's a challenge checklist that you might wanna look at that gives you everything you need from start to finish. I'm gonna point out these sample problems here in a little bit. There's resources for teachers. If you're interested in learning technical computing, we've got information about that. I strongly recommend looking at this scoring guide before the challenge. So if you want to know what judges are going to value in a solution paper, that's a really nice place to look, is in that scoring guide. And we just looked at the solution templates, and you're in one of the webinars. There is one more next week. So you might want to register for that one as well. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of stuff here in the resources page. And then one other thing I wanted to make sure I pointed out, if I look under resources, there's also this sample problems. So if you look under sample problems, there's two kinds of sample problems. There are all of the past problems and solutions. So there's the 2024 question, 2023 question. And if you click this Explore More button, you'll be able to see all of them all the way back to the first one, way back in 2006. But if I go to the 2024 problem, you can kind of see that there's a whole bunch of information here. So this is the question itself. But you'll also see winning solutions. So you can look at what the top teams did last year. You can see a list of winning teams. The judge commentary is also a really nice resource. So this is something that we have one judge who does all of the levels of judging. And so this is a commentary that he puts together to say, what did we see in teams? What did we like? What could have been improved? So looking that over could be very helpful in preparing. And then we also have a set of sample problems. So these winning solutions are going to be the top 6 papers, like those are the top of the top. If you want to look at some other papers that are not necessarily just that top piece, but like what were other teams submitting, there's a good set of sample papers here at this link. And then if you want to see pictures and video from 2024, you can find that at our media page. Okay, so we just looked at the past problems. Those are available. So what I showed you 2024, we've got all of them all the way back. And then we've also got these practice problems. And so this is the one that we were just talking about a minute ago about those 2 locks that are up near Jen. Okay, so I feel like I've talked a whole bunch. But now maybe, and I don't know if you've been looking at the chat, Jen, did you see any questions in the chat that you felt like you might want to address?
Yeah, so there were a couple. So one of them, where was it now? Let me find. Oh, so somebody asked about like what prerequisites are needed, right? And so I would really like to stress that as a judge, right, we are not looking for some like we don't have any preconceived notion of what the solution is going to look like, right? And so we have some people who do a very basic type of model, right? So let's say like last year's question was about housing stock, right? So you were trying to predict what the housing stock was going to be in these 2 places. And so you might have had people who came up with a very sophisticated equation to model the housing stock going out, but you also had people who came up with using a line, right? So there's really no prerequisite in terms of like you have to know this or you have to use this other model. The biggest thing, right? So like I've been doing, especially at the final round judging, right? Like I've been doing this for a really long time. And every single year at the judging, right? And I probably send this to Karen every single year to be like, my team, right, said this, is that the biggest thing is for students to explain why they made the choices that they made, right? And how they came about their model, right? So if you make a linear model, you can make a linear model that's great. And as long as you're explaining why you're choosing what you're choosing for slope, then that's just as good as having a complicated model. Even better would be to explain, like to say, hey, I made a linear model, but like go back to our housing stock idea, right? Like in a linear model, it's going to go off forever, right? Up, housing stock's probably not going to go up forever, right? But if you mention that, if you're like, hey, we know that this isn't good for like long term because this isn't like realistic, that's good too. So we look as judges to see, do we understand how you got the model that you got, right? And do we understand that you understand the limitations of your model? So I feel like that's an important thing to kind of throw out there.
That is super important. Super important. Yeah, I often find that it's the writing piece that matters a lot, right? So you can do the best math in the world, but I've seen solutions that come in, and I don't know if it's that teams ran out of time or whatever the case may be. That the only thing that appears there is their math, maybe sometimes a graph or something. And I'm sure they did amazing things. And I don't know what it is because it's just the math and the graph, and I don't know. So we really, really need you to say, here's why we did this math. This is why it's in front of you. Here's what these symbols mean. And when you look at the graph, this is the feature that you should be seeing out of it. And I always try to mention also that it is not, it's not a bad thing to say that your model isn't perfect. In fact, no model is perfect. None of them are, right? So if you say, just like Jen was mentioning, yeah, I have a linear model and that means it's going to increase. And I would be saying that the housing, you know, that the amount of housing is going to increase to infinity. And that doesn't make sense, that we're going to end up with an infinite number of houses on this planet. That doesn't make sense. So just saying there's a limitation to it. And if I had more time, I might be able to think about how, you know, how to model that better. That's a good thing. The judges want to hear you say that you are recognizing that as a weakness. I think I had a lot of concern about this as a student, saying, oh, I don't want to point out that my model isn't the most amazing, but that's a good thing actually. And so judges will appreciate it if you do that. So I think that's important to point out. Okay. Sophia asked, what are some things to avoid? Have any advice on that one, Jen?
Well, I would avoid taking something like from someplace and not citing it, right? So, you know, if you are using a resource, be sure to cite it, right? So be sure to cite it like in the paper. You can use resources to help you build your model, right? So, but again, just be sure to cite it. And, you know, like, again, using this housing stock model, right? Like maybe I go out and I find this place that is like, oh yeah, just enter these things and it spits out this amazing thing. So another thing I think sometimes is if your team is writing a computer program, be sure to explain, like, be sure to have your students explain like what the inputs, what the outputs mean, and to show that they know what they're doing, right? Like the more that the team in the paper can show what they're doing, the better. So I guess don't leave things up to the reader to interpret.
Right, that's a good one. I wanted to point out with respect to citations, there's no particular citation style required. So I don't even know what the styles are that are popular at this moment in time. Chicago, APA, I don't even know. Well, whatever those citation styles are, we're good with any of them, so long as you're consistent with any of those. So if you're, you know, at that place in the paper itself where you're kind of saying, hey, we're going to use this idea, if it's not yours, then you would want to somehow refer to, you know, a citation, and then all of the list of citations, the list of sources that you use should appear at the end of the paper. We usually recommend that the paper is 20 pages or fewer, but you can have as many citations as you want. So that doesn't count toward those 20 pages. Another thing that I wanted to point out to avoid is like make sure you look at either a template or the scoring guide, which will help you remember that one of the important pieces to have is this thing that's called an executive summary or a summary. The title of it doesn't matter. But basically the very first page of your paper should be some kind of summary. So what were the questions that were asked? What broadly, like what technique did you use? You don't have to get into the weeds in the summary, but what techniques did you use? And then a little teaser of what your results were. And you want to include those things for all three parts of the question. And then you probably have some sort of intro and some sort of conclusion. Sometimes you'll see in the challenge, it'll say, you may wish to have your summary written in the form of a letter to, and this depends on the kind of question. So I don't remember if this was one last year. If it was about the housing crisis, maybe you would want to be writing it to, the mayor of a city, what your recommendations are, so someone who would care about the particular issue. Not including that executive summary is a big deal. So that executive summary up front is for you to try and, get the judges excited about reading your paper. So you want to make sure you include that. So that's one of the things I would avoid missing out on that. So again, maybe that's a good reason to read through those rules and guidelines and make sure you know what all the pieces are in advance. Another thing that I was just reminded of as I was saying that is like what sorts of resources are you allowed to use? Pretty much everything is fair game except people who are not on your team. Okay, so you can ask questions of anyone on your team. You can use any sort of Google search. You can use any sort of books, any sort of whatever. The world is open except not people. So you can't ask your coach any questions. You can't ask any teachers any questions. You also can't post things on the internet in terms of like posting to some place where it's like, hey, I need help to get an answer to this question. That's not allowed because that is sort of interacting with people, even if they are not live people in front of you. So hopefully that makes sense. All right. Did you see anything in the chat, Jen, while I was talking that sounds...
Let's see. So I think somebody asked about like what could they do to prepare, right? And so I actually think that using as kind of Karen sent out, right, using some of those either like if your students didn't participate in last year's challenge, right, using like last year's challenge or one of the older challenge problems, or looking at one of the sample or practice problems, right? Our practice problems, I'll say in general, right, they're kind of problems that we really love, but we like, we think that there's maybe like an element to it that just doesn't work great for the actual challenge problem, right? So they end up kind of as a practice problem. But they're like really, like the one about the locks, right? We tried for many months to actually make that the practice problem, and we kind of we ran into a couple issues. One of the big issues being that there was actually a giant report that actually spells out a lot of the things we were hoping students would do in the challenge. But that actually makes it a really great practice problem, right? So like if you give it to your students and you say, hey, look at this, then you could check, I think in the practice problems, there's references.
Yes.
Like, yeah. So then you could check out some of the references and see some of the things that actually people do think about for those types of problems. And so that kind of would give you a good like starting off points.
I think that's a great set of preparation. That reminded me of another thought, and that is what happens if you find a solution to one of the questions? So somehow in your Google search, you turn up like, oh, there's somebody who's actually answered this question, and you look at it. I mean, in some sense, if it's already solved, should you just use their solution? What do you think about that, Jen?
So I think that like I don't think you should just like verbatim use their solution, right? But I think you could use their solution as like a springing off point, right? So maybe you could read their solution and be like, you know, in this reference, right? They say this, and here are some things that we would tweak about their solution, right? So, and I think if you're going to use a solution that somebody else has, make sure that you really are clear about the fact that you understand what's going on, right? So judges definitely pick up on, it looks like somebody went out and tried to learn this fancy like statistical thing and apply it, and the students don't know what they're doing. And this kind of like speaks to a message that somebody sent me that talked about like some of the winning papers, right? When you look at the winning papers, it looks like they've used really fancy math, right? And yes, in some of them they have, but and you are only getting like the top 6 winning papers, right? So when it comes through judging, there's actually like Karen knows the numbers, but there's like another chunk of papers that make it up to the top, right? And there are always papers that do not have a lot of fancy things, right? So so while like you can try to go out and learn a lot of different like statistical models and stuff like that, right? I think time would probably be better spent with your students on helping them learn how, even in a simple model, to just be very clear about why they made the choices that they made, where things come from. Because every year judges are like, I just want to know why they made this choice, right? Why did they pick a 2 in this problem? It seems the 2 came out of nowhere, right? Why did they do that? Rather than, and judges are always like, rather than see fancy stuff, I would really like to see things that are not fancy. So you don't have to do fancy stuff. And I want to,
absolutely.
yeah, I want to say that last year there was a team that didn't do fancy stuff that made it high. I don't remember if they made it to the top 6 or not, but they made it very high.
I remember that team, and I don't recall if they were in the top 6 when it was all said and done. It's always so hard at the very end.
I know, it really is. It's very hard.
So I wanted to circle back to the question about what's the best preparation. So you said probably looking over some of the practice problems and looking over past challenge problems. I might screen share again really quick. And there are a whole bunch of places that you could look on the website for information about, tons of information, I guess, is on this website. I did want to point out that we have a whole page on tips and guidance for how to prepare, right? So if that's what you're looking for, if you want to know what is math modeling, we have a page on that. These are the past challenge problems. We have practice problems. This is the score guide, and here's a link to a judge commentary, although there is one for every past challenge problem. So those are all good places to look. And then there's some other stuff about preparing, right? So have a plan and a backup plan for where you do your work. I mean, those are things to think about because you're going to need access to internet. So all sorts of things like that. Plan for food. That's a good one. You'll want to make sure you're able, you'll have time to eat during here. So there's a whole bunch of different tips that are involved that appear on this page. So I would encourage you to take a look at those sorts of things. Another, this was mentioned so there's in that list, there was what is math modeling? So there's a little description of what is math modeling here, and there's a nice set of videos that I would encourage you. These are really quick videos. I want to say a couple minutes each. There's a whole series on each one of the components of the math modeling process. So that's a nice quick way to learn about what is modeling. The other resource that I think is really nice, this feels a little bit self-promotional since I'm one of the co-authors, but I do like these handbooks. They're totally free to download that are about math modeling. So the first one is sort of an intro, like, what is this? How do I get started? And the second one focuses a little bit more on computing aspects and also on communication aspects. So like what sorts of graphs would be the best way to to communicate my ideas. So those are some more resources. I did see one question about how do I translate, like I've been working through the math part, and how do I move into the actual writing piece? How do I translate that into a paper? I think this Getting Started and Getting Solutions handbook could help with that. So there is a section on the how do I actually go to that communication piece. And again, this one on communicating could be helpful in that respect too. But Andy, if you have more specific questions about that, please let us know. Okay. What else are you seeing here in the chat, Jen?
I saw about like ratio of how much time you should spend on different like parts, like time, not time. Well, I saw two questions, I should say. There was one about how should team break up their time. And then there was another one about like ratio in terms of like the solutions. So I would say like in terms of like the solution papers, right? Like there is no ideal ratio, right? So like some teams are going to have a lot of assumptions, right? Like some teams are not going to have as many assumptions. Some teams are going to have lots of variables that they have to define. Some teams are not going to have lots of variables that they have to define. So there is no like, oh, this team did a really short thing versus this team did a really long thing. And while we're kind of talking about the solutions while Karen was talking, I did go to the webpage, and in terms of the sample solutions, I found the one that was a linear model, right? So it's the Canyon Crest Academy paper from last year. And they're in the top, and the model that they made for the first question is a linear model, right? And so, you know, and I distinctly remember them because I was like, yes, you did an awesome linear model and you explained it. Like I loved it, you know. And then in terms of like work time for your team, right? So sometimes as a judge, I would say to like I don't know that there's an ideal thing. It really depends on like how your team works, right? I would make sure that like your team's having fun, right? Because, you know, one of it is about having fun. The other thing I would say is from the judge perspective is that there have been times where it's just very obvious that they ran out of time in the writing, right? So be sure to leave time, like, you know, tell your team to leave time for writing, leave time to like proof and put the pieces together. Sometimes as a judge, it's obvious like teams have divided and conquered problems, so they split off, and the writing style is very different, which is totally fine, but there's no like transition. And so being able, you know, making it readable, right? So judges, when we sit down to read, we're reading a lot of papers. So the fact that the paper is like readable and easy to understand what's going on goes a long way. Especially if you think about like rounds of judging, right? So like in triage judging, right? Like the more readable your paper is, the easier it is for a judge to figure out what you did, to know what bin to put it into, right? Not that we really put it into bins. We give a score, but in my head, it's imaginary going into bins. I didn't want to, all of a sudden I was like, oh no, I made it sound like we do something we don't do. So.
One of the things that what you just said made me think of was, and now of course I will have lost it.
Was it about the team?
I think it was about time. One of the things that we have on our tips page that we found from past challenge participants that has been successful is identifying a person on the team who's sort of the lead, if you will. Doesn't have to be the person who decided you should compete. It's the person maybe who's going to be good at communicating. Okay, here's where we are. Everybody needs to get to this place by this time. Not location. I mean, all right, you have this amount of time, and then we're all going to check in, and everybody's going to say what the state of their part is, and what what they need help with. Keeping people on track, which doesn't mean that you need to have everybody like heads down, working, not talking the whole time. That's probably unrealistic. You've got 14 hours, but hopefully in the span of 14 hours, you've taken several breaks in there. You have permission to take a break. So you should account for all of that as well. But yeah, trying to keep things on track. I know we've heard in the past from teams that they may have gotten stuck and they just kept trying to grind away at one thing. And then all of a sudden, hours and hours have gone and they've just been down some rabbit hole, either looking for just the perfect data or something like that. And not been able to get out of it. And so having somebody who's able to step back and say, all right, listen, we have to move on. So let's make an assumption. Let's move with a linear model. Let's do whatever the case may be. Let's move on, and we need to, keep going through the challenge. So having somebody to step back and do that. Another way that I know teams have tried to think about how much % of their time to spend on what area is by looking at that scoring guide and seeing where like it'll say what % should be associated with each question. So that's a good idea for maybe how much time to spend on each question, but that's up to you. I would say it's probably important to get a really good solid solution for question 1. For question 2, you're probably spending a lot of your time there on question 2. It's oftentimes like the meat of the question. And then question 3 is usually this big wide open thing that probably you could spend 14 hours on it alone. So you like trying to narrow that one down and figure out what kind of what aspect of that one you're going to tackle, and how much time you might have to dedicate to that will depend team by team on that. Okay.
I would also say somebody put in to kind of add to the amount of time you're spending doing things, right? So like some of your time is going to be spent like trying to understand the problem and doing research and stuff on that problem. And so someone asked about getting data. And so I wanted to like let you know that those of us that write the problem, we also curate a sheet of data for you. And so that is made available with the problem. So you're given data. You do not have to use our data. But if your students are, say, like, they don't want to have to go look for data, they're not really sure how to find some of the data that they need, we have a lot of really very careful discussions and talk about like, well, maybe a team might do this, then I would want this stuff, and maybe a team might do this, so then I would want this stuff. And we work on the problem development team usually for like, I think this year we worked for like 2 months finding data. And so there is data there. As long as you cite your source, right? Like you can use like any data you find, right? Like, so we're not like, we don't go through and we're like, oh, well, this data was taken from this place, and like, nope. So again, right, math modeling is very open to interpretation. And so one team may take a slant on a problem that a different team might not take, and that's okay. And that data might look very different. You might find that data from very different sources. So I would say as long as your teams are citing their data, that like wherever they get it is fine.
We are really lucky to be joined by the previous program director, Michelle Montgomery, and she typed a message. Maybe she meant it for everyone, maybe she just meant it for me. But one of the things that she wanted to mention was that everybody should try to at least address each part of the 3 questions. So one of the things you could do if you, say, ran out of time and didn't get to question number 3, you might include something that says, we didn't get to question number 3, but here were some thoughts that we had. We probably would want to include this, and we probably would have wanted to include that. And so at least sort of addressing that question was out there is a good idea. And I do want to mention, sort of along the same lines with what Jen said earlier, I know for sure one of the technical computing awardees from last year didn't answer one of the parts of the questions, or at least didn't answer it sufficiently. So and they had to think about that one. Should we award this, should we award this to a team that didn't fully answer all 3 parts of the question? And in the end, the judges made the decision that that paper was so good and the technical computing was excellent, and they wanted to reward that work, even if teams didn't get a chance to finish all, to like completely finish all 3 parts of the question. So I hope the message here is that you should turn in a solution, even if you haven't gotten to all 3 parts. And that matters even more this year. We have these new awards that are called Spark Awards for Title I eligible schools in the US. And those definitely don't have a restriction that you have finished all 3 parts of the problem. So no matter how far you get, turn it in, upload your solution, and let the judges take it from there and make a decision. All right. What other questions do you all have? I don't know if have I missed any here in the chat?
I did see that Michelle is throwing, well, people are putting questions in, right? Michelle has been putting, she didn't put that one in the full chat, but she is throwing some little tidbits of information in there.
I know. Tons of valuable information from that source.
Yeah. Somebody asked if they're allowed to ask how many teams there are in total last year.
So last year, I think there were 100. Oh, sorry, 100, more than that. Last year, there were 800 teams that registered, maybe a little bit more than that. And I'm going to say approximately 650 that uploaded solutions. So 650 teams had their papers move on to judging. Approximately. We may be a little bit higher than that this year, but that's the approximate number of teams. I did, while we're thinking about number of teams, last year there was a restriction that we only allowed 2 teams per school, and we have lifted that restriction for this year. So if for some reason you already have your 2 teams from your school and somebody else expresses interest, you're allowed to have as many teams as you may like from every school this year. So that's pretty exciting. Okay. Let's see.
Trying to see. I will, like, we're still waiting to see if more people put stuff in. I will echo again Karen's sentiment about the that executive summary, right? So there are definitely times as a judge that we're like, oh, the paper was great, right? Like, and we really just wish that their summary was like that they had put a summary, right? And so it's really painful as a judge, right? When you can't give, as high of a mark on a paper as you want to, because it's missing that summary. So, and the summary really sets the stage, right? So it's the first thing that the judges are going to read. So having it, like, the writing be really clear is really helpful. It does not have to be the most technical part of your paper, right? So oftentimes in that part when we write the problem, when we say, you may want to write this in terms of, a letter. I think last year it was like to the head of like housing and urban development or whatever. So we give that to kind of be like, hey, it might be somebody who's not super familiar with math. Like, take that approach. Like, think about writing your summary as if you were writing it to someone that's not super familiar with math. All the judges are super familiar with math, right? But the idea is that the summary is supposed to be your team's way of making sense of, the math to somebody who maybe doesn't have a lot of, math background.
Good point. That's an excellent point, right? So that summary is sort of written for kind of a general audience at that sort of level.
Yeah, that's a good way to write it. Say it instead of the way that I'm like fumbling over it.
And Michelle, thank you for reminding everybody of this. You can update the students on your team all the way up through challenge weekend. So if someone gets sick last minute, if someone ends up having to travel and they're not going to be around and somebody else can fill in, you can just update your team record. So that means if you are logged in at the My M3 challenge, .siam.org. Oh, I'm like stumbling over my words for a little bit, but if you log into the system, you can add and delete team members as needed and update all of that information, update email addresses. You can update that all the way through challenge weekend. So So feel free. And so if you have two teams and somebody drops out, you guys can all consolidate into one of those two teams if you have to. So that makes we're super flexible on all that kind of stuff. One of the other fun things I wanted to mention, if you haven't heard of this yet, we also have a video contest associated with the challenge. So you can do a couple different types of videos, and one of them is sort of what was your challenge weekend experience like. So lots of this sort of came about because lots of people were collecting video of themselves during challenge weekend anyway and sort of posting it online, and we thought, oh, wouldn't it be fun if you compiled some of those things together and made a little video out of it. So if you are going to collect video, you might want to consider sort of piecing it together and coming up with a video of what was your challenge weekend like. Another option would be to upload a commercial for M3 Challenge. And so there's information on the website about the video contest. And we usually give people another week after the challenge to get their video together and upload that. Totally optional, but also super fun. We always have, from my perspective, I have the best time looking through those videos and saying, oh, they look like they were having so much fun. It was awesome.
Yeah. Anytime Karen shared them with us, judges, during judging weekend has played some of them or wherever, we're always like, oh my gosh, look at how much fun they had.
I know, it's so great. What are the prizes for video winners this year? I believe it's, let's see, I think it's, I don't remember if we said, Melissa will know. I'll let Melissa pop the page in the chat for us, if you would, Melissa. I know it's probably some t-shirts and swag, and then also, this is the part that I can't remember. Are they Visa gift cards or the Amazon gift cards? But something like that. So Melissa will pop that in the chat. Just a minute. Thank you. I was going to mention one more thing, and that is, so we've talked about the prizes a little bit. For the challenge, there's scholarship awards, but I think there's lots of reasons to participate in the challenge that are totally independent of the scholarship awards, and whether you win at any level, whether it's finalist, semifinalist, honorable mention, etc. There's lots of really good reasons to participate. So from your perspective, Jen, what would you say are some of the really awesome reasons to participate, independent of whether you're going to win or not?
Yeah. So one is that I think it's really important to see that math is more than just what you learn in a classroom, right? So like in a classroom, like you might learn about like slope of a line and all this stuff, and you don't really get the chance to apply that. And so I think the idea that you actually get to see math in action, right? And answer that, age-old question for your students, like, when am I ever going to use this? Like, here's where you could use math, right? So I think that's one of the ways. I also think that we definitely do try, when we write the questions, to think about questions that we think would be engaging and thought-provoking for the people who are going to be like working on the problems, right? Like there's lots of times when we're doing questions where like, will like, high school students actually find this interesting or not? And so I think that to kind of realize that like there are these problems in the world that like math can help solve is pretty cool.
I think that's awesome. Yeah. So obviously I work for a Society for Industrial and Applied Mathematics. So this is very near and dear to my heart, is that people understand that math isn't this super it doesn't have to be just this very abstract, X's and Y's, and I don't know why we're doing this. That matters to me a lot, for sure. For me, I also, I guess I get to hear back from past winners of the challenge. We ask them even years later, 10 years past when they participated in the challenge, what impact did this have on you? And we hear a few things over and over again, one of which is it gave me something to talk about when I did job interviews or internship interviews or whatever the case may be. It gave me something to talk about. I think that's a big deal. I remember when I was in high school having to write my first resume and thinking, I don't have anything to put on it. Like I've been in a club. It didn't seem like there was too much to put on it. So to be able to say, we started with nothing and came up with this set of mathematical models to solve a big problem in the world. That's huge. That's something really awesome to talk about. And I think there's a whole bunch of other stuff that comes along with it. The first time that we encountered something where I didn't even know where to begin. I didn't know how I didn't, there was sort of no template for how to do this because even word problems in school feels like, oh, okay, we're learning about parabolas. So I'm guessing I need to use a parabola, so it seems more authentic in that respect. The teamwork aspect cannot be overstated too, right? Those skills that you get working with other people, communicating with other people, navigating all of that stuff is a really big deal. It's a really big deal to employers to understand that you've been a good team player. So I think there's lots of great things that people can get from competing in the challenge that aren't even related to winning. So I wanted to make sure we talked about that a little bit. All right. It seems like we're coming up on the end of time. Does anybody have any last minute questions for us? Burning questions you've been thinking about this whole time?
Everybody's super quiet.
Well, I guess then maybe I'll remind everyone, if you haven't registered, the deadline for registration is tomorrow. So make sure you get yourself registered for the challenge. I want to say thank you so much to Jen for joining us. There is another webinar next week, and I'll be with Jen again. So we'll be able to give you some last minute tips to ace the challenge. So that'll be pretty exciting. And if you have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to reach out to us. I'll type our email address in here. So you're welcome to send us an email in the meantime and ask us any questions that you might have, any questions you have about registering, anything you have about preparing for the challenge. We're happy to assist. I know there's a ton of information on that website to wade through. So if you have any questions about resources, ask us. I bet we've got a resource for it that we can point you to. So we would love to do that. All right. Thank you all for joining. I really appreciate your time today, and hopefully we'll catch up with you again next week then.